Good morning. Go on the record in the matter of State of Utah versus MacNeill. Mr. MacNeill is present with his attorneys. The state's attorneys are present. We are outside the presence of the jury. Are there any housekeeping matters before we begin this morning?
So, it's not for today's proceedings. Could I have a minute, Your Honor?
You may.
Your Honor, there's a disagreement. The state intends to call one witness named Roma Henry, and there's a disagreement between the parties about whether notice was sufficient. We have not really been able to resolve that. I believe Mr. Spencer objects to our calling her. We wanted to put that matter before the court. We don't expect to call her until tomorrow, but if we could have that resolved today, Mr. Spencer would know whether he...
Could I hear your arguments on that right before the lunch break? Would that be okay?
That's fine with me.
Great. Would you approach the bench briefly? Anything else this morning before the jury comes in then?
Nothing from the state, Your Honor.
Who will you be calling first?
Joshua Motzinger.
Motzinger, if you could have him ready. Thank you. Please be seated. The court will call the matter of State of Utah versus MacNeill. Mr. MacNeill is present with his counsel. The state's attorneys are present, and the jury is seated. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for your being prompt today. Who is the state's first witness?
State calls Joshua Motzinger.
Mr. Motzinger, if you'll come forward here to the clerk's desk, please raise your right hand and be sworn. Thank you. If you'll be seated here, please.
Will you please state and spell your name for the record?
Yes. Joshua Motzinger, Joshua Motsinger.
And how are you employed?
I'm employed with Pleasant Grove City as a police officer.
And how long have you been employed in this capacity?
Since 2005, 9 years?
Okay. Are you currently post-certified?
Yes.
And you're certified to be a peace officer in the state of Utah?
Yes.
What is your current assignment?
I'm a sergeant in the investigations division.
What was your assignment on April 11th of 2007?
I was a patrol officer and FTO.
Were you called anywhere around noon on April 11th of 2007?
Yes.
Do you remember that day perfectly?
No.
Have you done anything to help refresh your recollection of the events on that day?
I've reviewed my reports, yes.
Okay. Do you remember where you were dispatched to?
I don't recall the exact address, but I know the area that I was called to.
What area was this?
The Mill Creek area,
You know what home it was you were dispatched to?
the MacNeill home.
What kind of a call was this?
It was a medical emergency call.
Were you told anything about this as you were en route to that location?
Yes.
What were you told?
I was told a 50-something-year-old female had slipped and fell into the bathtub.
Did you run lights and sirens to get there?
Yes.
Was there any confusion getting there?
I recall a little bit, but I don't remember the specifics.
Did you arrive at the same time as other officers or before them?
About the same time as another officer,
And which officer was that?
Ray Ormond.
And what was your professional relationship with Officer Ormond?
We were partners at the time, working the same shift.
But you were in different vehicles?
Yes.
What did you do when you arrived on that scene?
I arrived and went to grab my Ambu breather bag out of the trunk of my vehicle, and I don't believe I had one.
Did you grab anything else?
Some gloves.
Okay. Are you certified in CPR?
Yes.
What did you see as you grabbed your gloves and proceeded into the scene?
I went up the stairs. They were like a rock-type landscaping stairs, and I was greeted at the door by a gentleman.
Do you remember who this gentleman was?
I believe his name was Mr. Daniels.
Okay. Do you know what his relationship to the MacNeill home was?
A neighbor.
Okay. What did you do after you came to the front door?
We entered the residence and turned left, and were kind of guided somehow into the bathroom.
Which bathroom?
I believe it was the master bathroom.
Okay. What did you see as you came into the master bathroom?
I observed a female laying on the tile floor, and then I observed Mr. MacNeill performing compressions on her.
You say Mr. MacNeill, is that person in court today?
Yes.
Will you identify him?
Yes. He's sitting right there with a gray shirt on under his suit coat.
I'd ask that the record reflect he's identified the defendant.
You stipulate?
Yes.
The record will so reflect.
What was he doing as he was performing chest compressions on this female?
He was saying something to her. He was kind of yelling at her. Why did you do this? Why did you do this? And then he He struck her in the chest with one of his hands.
Why did you do this? And then,
Yes.
was there anyone else helping him with CPR?
Not that I recall.
Could you, what was the defendant wearing?
A white doctor's coat or a lab coat.
Could you tell if he was wet?
I believe it looked like his arms were wet.
Tell us about the female you saw on the floor.
The female was identified as Michele MacNeill. She was unclothed from the waist down. Her upper body had, if I recall correctly, like a white garment top on. She was wet, her hair was wet, and her upper body appeared to be wet.
What did you do once you had seen her and heard the defendant say, "Why did you do this?" and hit down on her?
Immediately, Officer Orman and I began to take over with CPR.
What part of CPR did you perform?
I believe I started with compressions.
And Officer Orman did what?
He did the breaths. He had the ambu bag, the breather bag.
You're doing chest compression skin on skin?
I don't recall.
Okay. Do you recall how Michele felt, her body?
Yeah, she was cold and her skin was wet.
What color was her skin?
It was pale white.
Did you notice any blood in the bathroom?
I did. I noticed a little bit of blood coming from some cuts around her eyes and her hairline.
Did you notice anything else about her face?
Yeah, there was some bruising. It appeared she had had a surgery, like a cosmetic facial surgery.
How long did you do CPR in the bathroom?
I don't recall, but it seemed like a couple minutes.
And then what happened?
We had another medic arrive on scene, and because we had ambulance and stuff en route, the bathroom area was quite small. We decided to move her to a larger area to continue.
Okay. May I approach, Your Honor?
Yeah, please.
We're going to project what has been previously admitted as State's Exhibit 22. Does this look familiar to you?
Yeah.
May I approach the witness?
You may.
So laser pointer on this. That's what it turns on.
Okay.
Will you use that laser pointer to point out where Michele MacNeill's body was in the bathroom?
She was right in this area here.
And will you also use it to point out where her head was versus her feet?
Her head would have been to the west, and her feet would have been down here to the east.
And now will you show us where she was moved to?
Yeah, we moved her from here through this little hallway down into here.
And again, will you point out where her feet were versus her legs?
Her head would have been here to the south, and her feet would have been here to the north.
Okay. I'm good, Kelly, on the legs. What happened when you moved her into the new location?
Officer Orman and I switched jobs within CPR. I then took over breaths, and he took over compressions.
Anything happen as you were doing CPR in the new location?
Yeah, Michele was, I guess, kind of getting her color back a little bit, you know, because we were circulating the blood around. There were some coughing type gurgling noises that she was emitting. And once, I believe it was the first responder medic that was there with us, we turned her to her side, and she expelled some water.
Okay. When you say turned her to her side, do you mean her head or do you mean her body?
Her whole body.
Okay. And she expelled some
fluid or liquid.
Yeah.
What happened to that liquid?
As I was, I was using the breather bag, so I was up by her head. When we turned her, I guess, do you want me to tell you how I was positioned?
Sure.
Her head was more in front of me, so my left leg would have been at the side of her face. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So when we turned her, that's when the water came out. The water came out, I'm assuming it was water, it was clear, went onto my arm, went down into my latex glove, and got on my pants a little bit and went into my boot.
Okay. How much water are we talking about here?
I don't know.
Do you remember how much was in your glove?
Enough if it went into each of my fingers, each of the glove portion of the fingers.
You remember how much went on your pants and in your boot?
I don't recall.
Did water also get on the floor by her head?
Yes.
You were performing breaths. Did you observe Michelle's chest rise?
I don't recall.
Do you think that her chest rose?
If it wasn't rising,
Sustained.
You are trained in CPR.
correct.
Tell us a little bit about the process of CPR when you're the person who's handling the breaths.
Okay. We were using an ambu bag. That's the name of it. When you squeeze the bag, the air will then go in through the mouth and make the chest rise. If the chest isn't rising, then we will reposition the mask, reposition the head, open the airway until we observe the chest rising.
Okay, so did you reposition the mask or anything?
I don't recall, but if the chest wasn't rising, I would have.
Okay. And so it's the practice in CPR that if you're not getting that chest rise, you check the airway and make sure everything is working.
Yes,
It should. And in this case, she ended up expelling water.
correct.
Why do you remember that this got all over in your glove and on your pants and in your boot and such?
Well, that was considered an exposure. At that point, the medics arrived. They took over what I was doing, and I, at that point, exited the residence.
Okay. You were on duty as a patrol officer,
I was.
and so what was your role in this event?
To be the first responder, report back to the medics what I observed, and perform life-saving measures.
Okay. What did you do after the paramedics took over?
I went to my vehicle. I believe I told my sergeant I had an exposure. I removed my glove, and then I don't recall if I had an extra uniform brought to me or if I went home to change. I lived out of the city at that time, so I don't recall.
Okay. Did you hear the defendant saying anything while you were there?
Yeah, he was kind of yelling some things,
Do you remember what?
cursing her for having the surgery. Why did you do this surgery? I told her not to do it, things like that.
Did he tell you what he thought had happened?
I had asked, generally when we arrived there, if somebody was there to witness what happened or is there for any information, we have a list of questions that we generally ask. And I believe I asked what had happened.
And what did he tell you?
He said that he found her slumped over into the tub.
And did he tell you anything else?
He did say that she had some facial cosmetic surgery. I did ask if he was, if Michele had been taking any medications or anything, and he said she was taking a lot of medications for it.
You're an expert on CPR?
No.
You're familiar with how CPR is to be done?
Yes.
Can CPR be done while someone is slumped over in a tub?
No.
And after your attempt at life-saving procedures, you went back on to patrol?
Yes.
Thank you.
You may cross.
Morning again.
Good morning.
How are you?
Good, how are you?
Good, thank
Good.
you. You filled out a police report near the time of this incident, isn't that correct?
Yes.
Was it the same day, do you recall?
I don't recall.
Okay. Most likely the same day?
Probably yes.
And in that police report, you indicated when, do you have a copy of it in front of you?
I do.
Okay. In your report, you indicated when you entered the room, you observed two male individuals doing CPR. Isn't that correct?
Yes, that's what it says?
Does that refresh your recollection at all?
Not really.
Not really? Okay. But when you wrote the police report, it would have been fresh in your recollection. Fair statement?
Yes.
Okay. And you testified here today that you believe that it was done Doug Daniels that met you in front of the house?
I don't know his first name. I believe it was Mr. Daniels.
Mr. Daniels, okay. Possible that it was Mrs. Daniels?
No, it was a male individual that I recall.
Okay. In your police report, you also indicated that you were unable to hear what Mr. MacNeill was saying, but he was clearly upset, correct?
Yes, that's what it says.
The information you testified to here today, do you believe that that's information, I'm sorry, strike that question, that was a bad question. You've made some statements here today about what you heard Mr. MacNeill say. Do you believe that your testimony about what he said is based upon what you actually heard or what you have been told by other people that responded with you?
It is what I've heard.
Okay. And in your report, you indicated that that as you went in relation to the first time you went in and observed two male individuals doing CPR, that you observed Martin pound on the victim's chest once with his fist and say, "Come on," right?
Yes.
You interpreted that to be an effort to restart her heart, didn't you?
I don't exactly know how I interpreted it at the time.
Okay. And you've been interviewed in this case by investigators Whitney and Robinson before, correct?
Yes.
And that interview was conducted with 4 officers altogether, right?
I don't recall how many.
There would have been Officer Roberts, Mike Roberts, right? Officer Mark Wright, is that correct?
I don't recall who was there.
Okay. May I approach, Your Honor?
You may.
showing you a copy of a transcript of an interview dated December 10th, 2008. Does that sound about right when you recall that interview occurring?
Yeah. Yeah, that was a while ago.
And in looking at the transcript, does it refresh your recollection at all as to who was there? Officer Roberts, Officer Wright, Officer Beckstrom, and Ray Ormond?
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Okay. And you, of course.
Yes.
And all of you were in the same room so that you could hear each other's responses to each question, correct?
Yes.
And to your knowledge, nobody was interviewed separately before that group interview, right?
Yeah, to my knowledge, I don't know.
You discussed in that interview the statement that you testified to during your direct examination about Mr. MacNeill saying that Michele was slumped in the tub, correct? Do you recall that?
I don't recall this interview, no, but I recall testifying to that, yes.
And if you turn to page 524.
Line 524.
I'm sorry, line 524. Thanks, Sam.
Okay.
And so during this interview, whatever Mr. MacNeill said to you, what you understood it to mean is that she was standing beside the tub looking in, maybe filling it up with water or whatever. Something happened and she slipped halfway in. Her upper body went in, her lower body stayed out, and she was just kind of slumped over at this point. That's what you understood, whatever Mr. MacNeill said to mean. Is that correct?
Yep, that's what I said at the time, so that's what I would have understood.
And when you arrived, you didn't see any water in the tub, correct?
I don't recall any water.
And you've testified before that you didn't see any water in the tub, correct?
Correct.
And as I understood your testimony today in relation to Mrs. MacNeill throwing up, that didn't occur until after her body was completely rolled over to the side?
Correct.
And you only recall her throwing up once, correct?
Correct.
And that didn't occur until after the paramedics had arrived and were starting to set up, correct?
They were setting up, but Officer Ormond and I were the ones still continuing CPR.
Right. And so then after that throwing up incident occurred, the paramedics who were setting up then took over CPR.
Yes.
And so you and Officer Ormond had been performing CPR for somewhere 3 to 5 minutes before the throwing up incident occurred. Fair statement?
Define a fair statement.
Does that seem accurate to you?
I couldn't tell you how long it was, but it seemed like forever.
Yeah. You arrived at the home at 11:55:05, correct?
That's what I remember, yes.
And you've got your report there that has that as well, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And from the time you arrived until you began CPR, less than a minute? Fair to say?
I couldn't tell you.
Okay.
Couldn't tell you. It would have been pretty quick after I arrived.
Okay. And then The paramedics, they didn't arrive until 12 o'clock, right?
If that's what the report says, yes.
And you can double check on there if you think I'm misreading it. Actually, it's not on this report. I'll cover that with the paramedics.
Okay.
Sorry.
No problem.
Have you been trained in using the ambu bag?
I'm sorry, what was that?
Have you been trained specifically in using the ambu bag?
Yes.
And so you're aware that over-aggressively using it can cause injury to the person?
Yes.
And can potentially injure the lungs by using it too hard, and can potentially fill up the stomach with air?
I don't know exactly what injuries can be caused by it, but when we were told to use it, we were explained how to use it.
All right. And as I understood your testimony here today, you indicated that Michele's color seemed to return right before the throwing up incident?
A little bit, yes.
Had her color returned before that, in the bathroom even, when you started CPR?
Not that I recall, no.
Okay. And during the time that you were working with Michele, you didn't notice any lividity, correct?
I didn't notice any, no.
And you didn't notice any rigor?
No.
You didn't notice any modeling or wrinkling of her skin?
No.
And you noticed that her hair, face, and clothes were all wet?
Yes.
And your recollection is that all she had on was a garment top and a bra. Is that correct?
Correct.
And by garment top, you're referring to a white religious garment?
That's what I believe it was, but I'm not absolutely positive.
A white top of some sort?
Yes.
In the course of your activities as a police officer, it's your typical habit to not interview fact witnesses together. Fair statement?
I'm sorry, what was that?
In the course of your activities as a police officer, it's your typical habit to not interview fact witnesses together. Fair statement?
That would be depending on the case.
And you've testified at the preliminary hearing that that's your typical habit to not interview fact witnesses together. Isn't that correct?
Yes.
I believe that's all the questions I have.
Thank you very much. Any redirect?
Yes, Your Honor.
I know this was a long time ago, so I apologize for some of these questions, but this seemed like a pretty intense situation. Were you looking for lividity or rigor or wrinkling?
No.
You said that you recollect her throwing up once. After that throwing up and expellation of water, what did you do?
That's when I helped, get some of the oxygen or something. Usually we'll help in with the medics a little bit, grab stuff out of their bags for them while they're taking over.
So you moved away from Michele at this point.
I did, yes.
Do you remember if Officer Ormond stayed with her?
I don't recall.
But he could have been with her.
He could have been, yes.
Mr. Spencer asked you about this line from the interview. Your answer was, the first thing that came to my mind is that she was standing beside the tub looking in it, maybe filling it up or whatever. Something happened and she slipped halfway in. Her upper body went in, her lower body stayed out, and she was just kind of slumped over at this point. That understanding, did that come from your interview with the investigators or from your discussion with the defendant?
That would have been with what I was explained to at the scene by Martin.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anything further? May Officer Motzinger be excused this morning?
Yes, and I would like him to still be under the power of subpoena.
You'll remain under your trial subpoena. If you're needed, you'll be notified.
Thank you. And this was...
I think this is your copy of the interview. Thank you. You may step down.
Thank you.
Next.
State calls Mark Sanderson.
Mr. Sanderson, if you'll come up here to the clerk's desk, please raise your right hand and take an oath.
You do solemnly swear the testimony you shall give in this case now can be further public with the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. If you'll be seated here, please.
Will you please state and spell your name for the record?
It's Mark Sanderson, M-A-R-C-S-A-N-D-E-R-S-O-N.
And how are you currently employed?
With Pleasant Grove City as their fire chief.
And would you move that mic a little closer to you? Thank you. How were you employed in April of 2007?
Also as the fire chief for Pleasant Grove.
What kind of training and experience do you have that makes you qualified for that position?
I have my bachelor's degree in emergency management along with my paramedic certification and all of the recognized fire certifications that come out of the UFRA.
Okay. What experience do you have?
I have currently 21 years experience in public safety in all of the disciplines, dispatch, police officer, fire, and medical.
And how long have you been the fire chief?
7.5 years. June of 2006 is when I took that position.
And prior to being the fire chief, what was your position?
I was a fire captain for Pleasant Grove City, and I was a full-time paramedic for Orem City.
And are you certified as a paramedic?
That's correct.
Are you also certified as a public safety officer?
Yes.
I'm going to ask you about April 11th of 2007 around noon. Do you remember the events of that time?
Yes.
Do you remember it perfectly?
Not perfectly. I mean, it's a long
Remember a lot of
time
it?
ago. I remember a lot of it, yes.
Have you reviewed any materials to help you remember that?
Yes, I have.
And what materials are those?
It was our actual run sheet, our medical report that the crew generates as far as our patient care report, along with an audio tape from an interview in, I believe, December of 2008, investigators from your office. And then also I reviewed my prelim testimony that I believe was given several months ago.
What happened at around noon on April 11th of 2007?
Pleasant Grove's ambulance was dispatched to the MacNeill residence on a female that was unconscious and not breathing.
So what did you do?
As the fire chief, I typically don't respond on those type of calls, but based on the circumstances, myself and our deputy chief responded to the residents to help the crew on this day.
And when did you arrive?
It was shortly after the first responders. Our system's set up so that we have a first response paramedic unit that responds. The ambulance was delayed at the time as far as they are paged and dispatched from home. They respond to the station, pick up the ambulance, and then respond to the house.
And what vehicle were you with?
I have a fire chief vehicle that I drove to the scene separate.
Was anyone with you?
Yeah, Chief Thomas.
Okay. And you said there was a paramedic crew that arrives first?
Yeah, actually we had our fire marshal, Steve Brand, he functioned separately in a vehicle. He also responded based off the nature of the call. And then Cody Jolly was a single resource paramedic captain that responded prior to initiate the care before our ambulance arrived.
And you arrived on scene soon after?
Yeah, I would say within just a couple of minutes following Steve Brand and Cody's arrival.
Okay. What did you do when you arrived?
I walked in the house to see how I could be of assistance.
Did you notice anything?
Yeah, my first encounter was with Mr. MacNeill at the entrance, the front room area of the home. I was drawn to him based off just his, the way he was acting, his behavior, just the way he was acting.
Tell us about that.
He was very excited, very loud. It was obviously his wife. And so I actually didn't spend much time at that point. I proceeded down the hallway to where they were initiating care on Michele.
And what happened when you went there?
I had just a brief moment, interaction with the crew to see how things were going, but it was obvious within just a few seconds, Mr. MacNeill's behavior made it so that I was drawn away from the patient care in an attempt to remove him from that exact location.
What was he doing?
He was just loud. He was telling us he was giving us orders as far as treatment care, treatment things that we needed to do for Michele.
What could you tell us about these orders?
Specifically, he was requesting that we give her epinephrine. And there's epinephrine's given in this type of circumstance, but there's a lot of things that we take care of prior to that. We follow the ABCs: airway, breathing, circulation. Epinephrine is one of our cardiac medications that we would give in the course of the treatment, but he was so disruptive to the crew that as the fire chief, and it wasn't my responsibility to be the patient care person, that I actually asked him to come with me. I removed him from the actual patient care scene so that, I could gather some information about what was taking place. And also, I was going to put him on the phone with Dr. Van Wagner, who is the emergency room online physician for us at American Fork Hospital.
Okay. What effect was his behavior having on you?
Oh, it was concerning enough that I asked him to step away from what we were doing at the time.
Do you remember how he was dressed?
I don't recall specifically his attire, but as I initially approached the home, there was no question, and my initial contact with Mr. MacNeill, there was no question that he was a doctor.
How did you know that?
I don't know. I don't know. I don't know if it was how he was dressed, or if it was something he said, or it was just the course of the information he was asking us to do. As far as the medications, it was clear that it was in the medical field. And if I recall, I believe from the original interview, I believe I remember one of the guys saying he had a pair of scrubs on or a doctor's lab coat.
Who else was there?
Our deputy chief, Dave Thomas, Steve Brand, our fire marshal, Cody Jolly was the captain, Steve Carroll came on the ambulance with Eddie Hales, and I believe Lance Carpenter.
Do you remember anyone else there that was not emergency personnel?
A neighbor was at the residence when I first arrived.
A neighbor of the MacNeills?
Correct.
You said you came in and were able to assess the scene briefly.
Right.
What did you see when you assessed the scene?
I made contact with Cody just to determine where they were at, if they needed more help. I believe there were a couple officers that were assisting with CPR. And it was I remember it being a small confined space. There wasn't room for me to engage in the patient care.
What could you tell us about the patient?
That looking over Cody's shoulder, I recall her being very pale. Her hair was wet. She had some incisions above both eyes that were bleeding running down her temples. And she was obviously lifeless.
So you asked the defendant to come with you away from the patient.
I did.
What was he saying then?
My intentions, like I explained, was to try to understand what had taken place. He made a couple of comments in my history gathering. In pulling him away, typically we would handle this right there where the scene's taken place. We could ask the questions, we could receive the answers in an area where the entire crew would be able to hear the information that was provided, but based on just his behavior, I took him away from that, so the other crew members didn't have the same luxury as I did as hearing what took place. But a couple of comments specifically in me gathering what possibly could have happened was that he made a comment that she had overdosed on her pain medication, and also a comment about slipping in the tub and hitting her head. He also indicated that he was only gone for a short period of time.
Did he say where he had gone?
I don't recall specifically where he had gone. Maybe it seems like it was like a 10 or 15 minute. It was a very short period of time, which it gave us hope that there was a short downtime that we would be able to have some luck in resuscitating Michele.
Okay. You've talked about some of the things he was saying. Physically, what was he doing?
It was very animated. I mean, he was moving about quickly, up and down the hall, in the living room, out onto the front porch. It was very hard to keep him in one place.
Did you observe any difficulty in his movement?
No, there was no difficulty.
Previously, you had testified about a statement where he said, "I'm a doctor." Do you remember that statement?
Objection leading.
Overruled. He may, I assume you're impeaching your own witness. Overruled.
The comment in reference to him being a doctor would have been when I tried to put him on the phone with Dr. Van Wagner. We deal with medical physicians on our scenes often, and so what we try to do routinely is put doctor to doctor on the phone. That way they have a higher level of training. It's just, it makes more sense to allow them to relay the information to our online physician. It was clear that he didn't want to talk to Dr. Van Wagner, and I recall perfectly that he wanted to talk with another doctor that specifically he worked with. I don't recall that doctor's name, but he asked to talk to somebody different than Dr. Van Wagner.
Okay. Do you remember in a previous interview saying that he said, "I'm a doctor, she's dead"?
I recall saying that. I can't right now vividly remember that exact comment, but I know reviewing my material, that's something that I said.
That was something you had said previously.
Correct.
How many of these kinds of scenes have you been on, Chief Sanderson?
A lot. Over the course of 21 years, I would say easily over 100 cardiac arrest situations.
Okay. How were the resuscitation efforts working on Michele?
They weren't working at all. I mean, we did everything within our toolbox, medication-wise, treatment, CPR, airway management. Everything that we possibly could have done was provided with no positive effects.
You had put on patches to measure for signs of life?
Correct.
Intubation?
Yes.
You said you'd given some substances of some kind. What were those?
In reviewing the report just this morning, I noticed that we'd given epinephrine, atropine, sodium bicarb, That was what was indicated on the front sheet of the run report.
Did you give Valium,
No, we did not.
Percocet,
No.
Phenergan,
No.
any CNS depressant type drugs?
No.
Is it your practice to give those kinds of drugs in resuscitation efforts?
It is not.
Now, in a previous statement, you said you remembered something about pink sweats. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I do.
Could that have been a pink towel?
Yes.
Objection, speculation.
Sustained. You may test his own memory.
How well do you remember those pink sweats?
I don't remember them very well.
You just remember something about that.
Yep.
Do you have a specific recollection of that?
Do I have a specific recollection
As
of?
opposed to a memory of saying something about that?
No.
Did you talk to the defendant again after some of this had been going on?
I did not have any other conversation with him after we left the residence.
Okay, before you left the residence, did you talk to him about what he thought had happened?
Oh, yes.
And what did he tell you?
That she had overdosed on her pain medication following surgery. And he also offered that she could have slipped and fell in the tub. I don't recall specifically if it was could have, should have. It was just offering, I was gathering information on what could have potentially happened that brought us here today.
And you said he said he'd only left for a few minutes.
That's correct.
Did he say how many minutes?
I cannot recall specifically. I know that it was a short period of time, and yeah.
Did he say how he had found her in the tub?
I can't recall specifically how he found her.
You remember stating previously that he had found her face down in the tub with her legs up?
I do recall that.
Do you remember any comments about the LDS Church?
Yes, there was one comment specifically, and that kind of led to his behavior and why he seemed so angry, in the sense that based on his affiliation with the church and the amount of money that he's donated, this is how God's repaid him.
Do you remember specifically what was said?
Exactly what I just said.
Did you say that again? I didn't understand.
That based on being an LDS member, and the money that he has donated, this is how God's repaid him.
Did you observe anything in the bedroom area?
I don't recall.
Medications?
I know there was talk over the medications, but I don't recall specifically seeing them.
Okay. Is the chief, did you stay at the scene or did you go to the hospital after this?
I went to the hospital after this.
Okay. And what could you tell us about what happened at the hospital?
We moved into the very first, it's the trauma bay at American Fork, where the resuscitation was continued. Report was passed on to the Dr. Van Wagner and his staff. It was within a very short period that Mr. MacNeill arrived at the hospital, and I don't know how if he was personal vehicle or rode with somebody, but he did not ride with us.
What was the defendant like at the emergency room?
His behavior continued to the point where the ER staff was required to call security.
And when you say continued, will you describe that?
Just his angry demeanor, loud, disruptive.
And physically, what was he doing?
He was back and forth in the trauma bay, out into the hallway, around the nurse's station. He was just very mobile and about the ER.
Could I have a second, Your Honor?
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. You may cross.
Morning.
Morning.
You never said anything about security being called in the ER in the past, have you?
I don't recall if I said that previously.
You've had a number of opportunities to talk about the events on April 11th, 2007, correct?
Yes.
You had an interview on December 10th of 2008 with investigators Whitney and Robinson,
Yes.
correct? And that was a joint interview with you and Officer Motzinger, Dave Thomas, Steve Brandt, Cody Jolly, Mark Sanderson,
Yes.
correct? And Your Honor, may I approach?
You may.
Handing you a copy of that interview transcript. And if you turn to line 90, during the beginning part of this interview, there was discussion about having everybody interviewed together. And Mr. Whitney told you all, he says, time has gone by, we understand that and the memory, sometimes people can, remind each other of things that may have happened, and we don't mind that. This is not one of those things where it's a shooting and we have to separate everybody. Do you recall Mr. Whitney saying that?
Yes.
That strike you as odd?
No.
No? So if it's a shooting, then you would separate people, but if it's just a homicide investigation, you don't need to?
I don't recall specifically at the time that we knew this was a homicide investigation.
Okay. And the interview proceeded with all of you answering Mr. Whitney's questions within the hearing of each other, correct?
Oh, yes.
And during this interview, you were the only one who recalled the pink sweats, correct?
That's correct.
And so then at the preliminary hearing, you testified that you began to doubt your recollection of the pink sweats because nobody else recalled it but you.
That's correct.
But at the time of the interview, that was your recollection.
Correct.
You also recalled that Michele's hair was wet, but her clothes were dry.
That's correct.
And you believed that she had been removed from the tub and dressed in dry clothes before you arrived, correct?
I think I offered that as a solution to what I perceived in that interview.
And that was because you perceived that her clothes were all dry, but her hair was wet.
Yes.
In relation to your comments about your discussion with Mr. MacNeill and what may have happened, you indicated today that you were talking about things that may have happened, correct?
I was gathering history to try to determine, what information can we pull that will help us treat Michele.
And Mr. MacNeill similarly was guessing on things that may have happened, correct?
Speculation.
Sustained.
You had asked Mr. MacNeill what may have happened, correct? And he responded to you with things that may have happened, correct?
Yes.
In relation to your discussion about time, you don't have any recollection about what Mr. MacNeill may have said about how long he had been away, do you?
I specifically recall that it was a short enough time that I felt like we had an opportunity to resuscitate Michele.
As far, well, whether he had been away for 2 hours or 15 minutes, that wouldn't tell you how long Michele had been down, correct?
Oh, yeah. I mean, in asking him how long he was gone, the thought process was that he was just at the house, he was with her, and then 10 to 15 minutes later he returns and finds her that way. Yeah, that's a significant difference than if he had been gone from the residence for 2 hours.
If he'd been gone from the residence for 2 hours, Michele could have gone down right before he got back as well, correct?
Yes.
So whether he's been gone for 2 hours or 10 or 15 minutes, it doesn't really tell you how long Michele has been down, correct?
Well, it does. It tells us that it's only been 10 or 15 minutes,
Okay.
if that's all he's been gone.
All right, you recall having an interview with Jeff Robinson on August 2nd of 2012?
Yes?
And
You may.
And Investigator Robinson asked you about,
Your Honor, I'm going to object it's hearsay at this point. I don't know what purpose it's being offered for.
Inconsistent statement, or
By this witness?
was he interviewed?
yes?
Could I see it? Highlighted. Overruled.
Investigator Robinson asked you about your conversation with Mr. MacNeill as well, correct?
I don't recall specifically the details of the interview.
Do you recall saying that Michele could have been, he was gone for 10 or 15 minutes or 30 minutes?
Yeah, I don't remember ever saying 30 minutes.
Okay, so if Investigator Robinson wrote that down, he was in error?
My recollection, yes.
At the preliminary hearing, you testified that you don't remember the exact time period, correct?
The exact time period, I don't remember the exact time period. 10 to 15 minutes is what I recall.
You recall your impressions, is what you recall, right?
Okay, yes.
In your observations of Michele, you noticed that the incisions on her face were gaping open, correct?
Yes, both eyelids.
And in relation to Mr. MacNeill, you've indicated that he was very emotional.
Yes.
You indicated in your interview in December of 2008 that you as paramedics, you wouldn't have worked on Michele if you'd noticed signs of rigor or lividity or things like that.
That's correct. We would not have.
And so regardless of your impressions from your conversation with Mr. MacNeill, the physical observations of Michele's body led you to work on her to try and revive her. Fair statement?
Yes?
Officer Ormond and Officer Motzinger have testified that as they were performing CPR, that Michele pinked up. Do you recall noticing that in your observations?
I didn't get, I only witnessed Michele and the resuscitation efforts for less than 60 seconds. I mean, I looked over Cody Jolly's shoulder. I got my initial impression that this was obviously very critical, and then my attention was drawn to Mr. MacNeill.
You didn't know Mr. MacNeill from before this event, correct?
That's correct, I did not.
So you don't know what his baseline, so to speak, mannerisms are, correct?
I do not.
Do you have your report, the Pleasant Grove ambulance report?
I didn't bring it, but I reviewed it right before I came down this morning.
Did you participate in creating this report?
I did not.
Based upon your recollection, is it accurate that the ambulance was dispatched at 11:52
Yes,
and that arrived at the scene at 12 o'clock?
yes.
And would that would have been before you arrived?
No, I would have arrived prior to the ambulance.
Prior to the ambulance?
Yeah.
May I approach, Your Honor?
May.
And maybe you can help me understand this. And so, is there anything on this report that indicates or documents whether this arrival time was you or the ambulance?
That would be the ambulance time. Right here in this box, it shows an A, that's ambulance. The R is our rescue unit. That's our first response.
Okay.
That's why the times arrival en route, we went en route 5 minutes quicker and we arrived 5 minutes sooner because they're at the station and respond immediately upon dispatch. Where the ambulance, they were paged to respond from home, get the ambulance, respond to the home. That's why there was that 5-minute difference in our paramedic response and our ambulance response.
Okay. There's nothing in this report that documents what you've testified to today about your conversations with Mr. MacNeill, is there?
No.
And in the EMS report, it indicates that that a glucose check and dextrose or glucose or sugar needed to be restocked.
That's correct.
And is that because a glucose check and dextrose would have been given by the paramedics?
Yeah, that's what that indicates.
And at the preliminary hearing, you testified that you did not give glucose, correct?
That's correct.
Is that still the way you feel today?
I didn't witness the glucose being given, and if I recall, what I testified was that it's one of the drugs that's completely to the end. It's a medication. Dextrose is something we would give when we are completely out of exhausted our resources, and it was given just to see if it would make a difference. And so I didn't witness it given, and that's why I testified that it wasn't given.
Oh, may I approach?
You may.
Could you show me where you said those things at the preliminary hearing?
Said about the sugar?
About it being the last ditch effort?
Well, I can't say that's what I said at the preliminary hearing. That's when and why we would have given sugar, is at the end.
What you actually said at the preliminary hearing is that no, you did not give glucose, correct?
And it was based off of the report, which on the front of the report, which is the run sheet, shows that we did not give sugar.
It doesn't show anything about sugar.
And reviewing the report today, I would assume it's because all of the medication boxes are full. So we've listed all of the other medications that are our primary cardiac medications. It's filled up the space completely. We surely just ran out of space. So if sugar had been given, if I was writing the report, I would have written it into my narrative that sugar was given, but there was nothing indicated on the report other than the restock that sugar was given. So in reviewing the report, I felt that sugar wasn't given.
So when you were asked at the preliminary hearing, question, is it your testimony today that she was administered glucose? You answered, no. I would say that she was not administered glucose. As a matter of fact, if you look at the report, there wasn't even a blood glucose check, which we would always check a blood sugar level before we administer blood sugar or glucose. Sorry.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly what I've said today, is that if you read the report, we didn't give blood sugar, or we didn't check a blood sugar or give sugar. Now, on the restock form, which I've clarified, it shows that we restocked it. And so that in itself says that we used it. But when you look at the front of the report, it doesn't say that we gave D50. And I wasn't the primary paramedic that would have ordered or pushed the medication. And so if that was given while I was talking with Mr. MacNeill, that was something that I wasn't witness to.
And at the preliminary hearing, I asked you about glucose, and you told me that you didn't recall. Then Mr. Peed asked you about the glucose that we just read, where you said no, it wasn't given. Correct?
Yeah, I think I'm saying the same thing.
Okay. Regarding the clothing that Michele was wearing at the preliminary hearing regarding the upper clothing, you said your recollection was all she had was a garment top.
Yes.
You were referring to a white religious garment?
Yes.
At the preliminary hearing, when you were asked about your recollection of the time period, you indicated that your recollection is not crystal clear. You just recall it being a short time period. Correct?
I don't understand what you're asking.
At the preliminary hearing, when you were asked about the time period that Martin relayed to you that you testified about today, you indicated that your memory is not crystal clear. You just recall it being a short time period.
That's correct.
And at the preliminary hearing, also, you said that Martin was emotionally upset and frantic.
Yes.
That's all the questions I have, Your Honor.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
You testified today about some religious comments about Mr. MacNeill.
Yes.
Today is the first time that you have testified about those comments allegedly being made, correct?
I don't recall if I testified about them previously.
Okay. That's all the questions I have.
Thank you, Mr. Spencer. Mr. P., do you have redirect?
Yes. In a previous interview, you brought up the religious comments, correct?
Yes.
Your observations on Michele, how far away were you from her?
4 feet standing above her, 2 feet back. I mean, I was relatively close, but I couldn't touch her.
You didn't touch her clothing?
I never touched her. or her clothing.
Did you look for lividity or anything like that?
Yes, just my general appearance, but obviously laying on her back, I would only see the top half of her where lividity is going to be underneath her, underneath where, she's touching the floor, typically.
Is your testimony today based on your memory or what you've heard from other people talking about this case?
It's based on my memory.
Thank you.
Anything further from the defense?
At the interview, you testified that, that her hair was wet and her clothes were completely dry, correct?
Yes.
The December 2008 interview,
Okay.
right? At the preliminary hearing in October of 2012, you testified that her hair was wet and her clothes were dry, correct?
Yes. Yeah, I've said that all along.
Yes. And that's based upon, that's what you recalled being the case from your observations, correct?
Yes.
Fair to say that, perhaps all of your observations aren't correct?
I don't think that's fair to say.
Well, you doubted your observation of the pink sweats at the preliminary hearing, right?
Yeah, but I told you that was my perception. That's what I recall seeing.
Yeah, you recall seeing pink sweats, but you said that you doubt it because nobody else recalled it the way you did.
Right.
And nobody else recalled the timing quite the way you did either, did they?
I don't know that.
Okay.
I don't know what other people have recalled on the timing.
Okay. That's all the questions I have.
Your Honor, with the last witness, we forgot to ask the jury about questions. I don't have further questions.
Thank you. Do any of you have questions for this officer? And let me just inquire, did you have questions for the prior witness? Anyone? The record should reflect no. If you could pick those up for me, please. The record should reflect that no juror had a question for Officer Motzinger, who has been released. If you'll approach, please. Mr. Sanderson, was a blood sugar test restocked?
Yes. On the restock form, it indicates that blood glucose check and dextrose D50 was restocked.
And you may have answered this, was a glucose or dextrose restocked as well then?
I can't tell you that it was physically restocked, but the form would indicate that the paramedics did restock that following that call.
The other question the jury had was that you testified that you don't usually respond to these situations, but under the circumstances you went. Why was this call different that would cause you to respond?
Pleasant Grove Fire Department was just currently in the transition of going from a volunteer organization to a full-time organization within the next 2 months, actually. So we were in our preparations for staffing. We were moving forward with a grant that we'd received so that we could have a staffed fire station respond immediately and do away with the 5-minute delay response from the ambulance being paged and coming to the station. I don't know if it was just the typical untypical day where I wasn't tied up in a meeting, but based on the unconscious, not breathing, a single paramedic responding to the house, you know they're going to be overwhelmed, you know they're going to need help. And especially for me to grab our deputy chief and both of us respond, that's not normal, but based on the circumstances, and it could have easily been just the sheer nature of the dispatch, whether it's the tone of the dispatcher's voice. There's a lot of circumstances that come into play that make me decide if I want to respond to either help or just observe the guys and how they're doing their job.
Do you have follow-up questions?
Yes, can I just do it from here, Your Honor?
If you're picked up, yeah.
So your testimony today, to clarify, is that you did not witness glucose being administered, and it's not on the incident report cover sheet as you would have expected.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Anything further from the defense?
As I understand your testimony today, when you arrived at the scene, Mr. MacNeill was already out in the doorway living room area.
That's correct.
Okay. That's all the questions I have.
Nothing from the state, Your Honor.
Very good. Would you like Mr. Sanderson to remain under his trial subpoena?
Yes, Your Honor.
You'll remain under subpoena. If you're needed back, you'll be notified. You may step down today.
Your order about the televised communications on the trial still in effect then?
It does. Would you discuss with him his obligations under that order, please? Thank you.
Thank you.
Next.
They call Stephen Brandt.
You'll come up to the clerk's desk. Please raise your right hand and be sworn.
You do solemnly swear the testimony you shall give in the case now coming before the court will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. If you'll be seated here, please.
Will you please state and spell your name?
Stephen, S-T-E-V-E-N, Brand, B-R-A-N-D-E.
And how are you employed?
I am employed for BidSync right now.
Okay, and how were you employed in April of 2007?
I was employed with Pleasant Grove Fire Department
In what capacity?
as a captain paramedic.
And are you currently a certified paramedic?
Yes,
And were you a certified paramedic on April 11th of 2007?
yes.
And what, tell us a little bit about what your job entailed around that time.
Around that time, I would respond to fire and medical calls. Generally, I was responding ahead of an ambulance or the fire apparatus, so I would generally arrive at the scene prior to their arrival.
Okay. Do you remember the events of April 11th of 2007 around noon?
I remember most of that.
You remember it perfectly?
Not perfectly.
Okay. Tell us about how you got onto that call.
We were dispatched to a female that was reported to be underwater in a bathtub.
And were you given a location of where this was?
We were given a location.
And how did you respond to that?
I did.
And how did you respond?
I responded with lights and sirens.
Who were you with?
I was by myself in Suburban, so it would be a quick response unit.
Okay. Do you remember arriving there?
I do.
Do you remember what time it was you arrived?
I don't remember the arrival time.
What happened when you arrived?
When I arrived, I noticed that we had police officers there already, so it made it easy to get there, to know where the scene was. When I arrived, Mr. MacNeill was on the front doorstep yelling at me,
When you say Mr. MacNeill, could you point out who you're talking about?
the defendant.
The defendant?
Mm-hmm.
I'd ask the court to have the record reflect he's identified the defendant.
You stipulate?
Yes.
It will so reflect.
He's on you say the doorstep?
Yes.
Okay, and then what happened?
He was yelling at me, "What's taking you so long? Get inside." And I was in the process of getting my equipment out of the vehicle, and then I went in.
So he was saying, what's taking so long? How was he physically?
He was very agitated, very angry.
Do you remember how he was dressed?
I don't remember the specific clothing.
And so did you go inside the residence at that point?
I did.
And what, if anything, did you observe?
I observed 2 police officers doing CPR on Mrs. MacNeill by the bathtub.
Okay. What happened after that?
I asked them to move her into the bigger room so that we had room to work on her.
What kind of floor was it in the bathroom?
I believe it was a tile floor.
Do you remember what kind of floor it was where you had moved her to?
It was a carpeted floor.
What happened when she was moved into the area on the carpet?
CPR was continued and we started hooking up equipment to her.
And what was your responsibility in this situation?
I was kind of directing what was going on with the police officers and myself until more paramedics arrived.
Do you remember what this patient was wearing?
I remember that the patient had clothing on. I don't remember the type of clothing. She had clothing on top and bottom.
Okay. What was the defendant doing while you were setting up and getting ready for other paramedics?
The defendant was yelling and screaming around the patient, and then he was kind of moved away by the police officers, so we had an opportunity to work on her.
Do you remember what he was yelling or screaming?
At the time, I don't know initially what he was saying. Throughout the working her, there was times when he would yell and scream about, I've given the church this much money, so much money and time, and this is what I get for it. There was screaming about that she might have taken some medication, and there was something else that he was yelling about. Oh yeah, that she had, that about the surgery that she had, and that she had to have that surgery, and look at what it did to her.
What if, well, you've remarked on some of the things he was saying. Physically, what was he doing?
He was kind of darting in and out of the room. He would be there for a minute or so, and he'd be gone again, and then he'd come back again.
Did his actions have any effect on what you were doing?
Yes, I was concerned about my safety, actually. And part of that was the fact that there was so much agitation there that I didn't know, I couldn't predict what his actions was going to be. I think there was probably a couple of us that had asked him to be removed from that area because it was just too distracting to be able to concentrate on what we were doing.
At the time that you were there doing this, were you aware of his profession?
I wasn't aware initially of his profession. I was later on the scene.
On the scene, and how did you become aware of that?
I think it started to come about when he started asking what kind of medications we had given the patient, and asked whether or not we had given her epinephrine and stuff.
Okay, so it was kind of obvious to you based on what he was talking to you about? Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
As in your assignment, did you go with the patient to the emergency room?
I didn't go with the ambulance. I went to the emergency room behind the ambulance.
Okay, was the defendant at the emergency room when you were there?
Yes.
Can you describe how he was acting on that occasion?
Again, it was a very agitated state. He was yelling and screaming.
You remember what he was yelling or screaming?
I remember him yelling, "I'll give you all that I have if you'll just save her." And then he also, at one point, begged Dr. Van Wagner not to stop resuscitative efforts.
Did you touch the patient physically?
I did at the scene.
At the scene when you touched her, what was she like?
She was very pale. She was cold. Her hair was wet. Her skin was wet. The clothes that she had on was dry, or somewhat dry. They may have been getting a little bit moist from inside out.
As one of the paramedics on scene, are you aware of anything that was given to this patient?
In terms of our medications,
Correct.
she was given epinephrine. I know that she had that.
Do you know of anything else she was given?
I don't recall it. She may have been given atropine, but I'm not sure on that.
Was she given any CNS depressants like Valium, Phenergan, Percocet?
No, they would be contraindicated in a situation like that. We're trying to revive her, not depress her.
I have just a minute, Your Honor.
You may.
You mentioned two things that you'd given her, epinephrine, and the other was?
It may have been, we may have used atropine. It's a medication that at that time was sometimes used for asystolic patients. That would be the patients that are flatline. Sometimes it helps bring back a rhythm.
Are you familiar with incident reports that are filled out on these kinds of events?
Yes.
If you were to review that, would you be able to tell us what she was given?
I would be able to tell you what was written on the report, yeah.
Okay. May I approach the witness, Your
You
Honor?
may.
Will you look at that?
Sure.
Do you recognize that?
I do.
And what is it?
It is a run sheet for Michele MacNeill.
And will this be able to tell you what she may have been given on this occasion?
Yes.
Could you tell us what that is?
She was given epinephrine first. She was given atropine, and she was also given sodium bicarbonate, and as well as the NS that goes, that's IV fluid that's administered by bagging her
Do you have a specific recollection of her being given these things?
Yes. I mean, I recollect that she was given those medications. I'm not sure, you know, I was mostly running the monitor down below, so I wasn't up by where they were administering the medications, but I remember hearing them say that they were administering those.
And what does this monitor measure?
The heart monitor measured the electrical activity in the heart.
Do you remember what that monitor was showing throughout the attempt to revive her?
Yes, she was asystolic, which means, in layman's terms, that's flatline. There was no electrical activity.
And you were never able to restore that in any way?
Correct, we were not.
I think that's all I have. I'll retrieve that from you if I could.
Thank you. You may cross.
Yes, there was.
Good morning.
Morning.
You didn't testify at the preliminary hearing in this matter, correct?
I did not.
But you were present during an interview in December of 2008 with investigators Whitney and Robinson and your other cohorts?
Yes.
And do you recall that interview?
Yes.
And you would have endeavored to accurately reflect things during that interview to the best of your ability, correct?
Correct. It would be probably about a year and a half after, so.
And obviously now it's a lot longer than that, correct?
Sure.
All right. In the interview, you indicated that you were able to drive directly to the address, correct?
Correct.
And you responded after officers Motzinger and Ormond, correct?
Yes.
And before Chief Sanderson?
Yes.
And your recollection is that Michele had on a white shirt?
That may have been the case. I don't remember specifically that was the case. It may have been that I remembered it back then, but I don't remember it now.
Okay. Is the interview transcript still up there?
Looks like it. Is this the one you need? I'm not sure.
Yes, I
Okay.
think so. Would you turn to line 326?
Okay.
And so in your interview in December of 2008, it's fair to say that you said that you can remember cutting off a white shirt and a garment top, and I believe that she had just garment bottoms on, but I'm not sure about that.
I see that, yes.
Is that what you believe you said back then?
I believe I said that, yes.
You've described Mr. MacNeill as being quite frantic on April 7th, or April 11th rather, 2007, correct?
More agitated than frantic.
Would you turn to line 175? In your interview, you described him as acting pretty frantic, correct?
Correct.
And that was closer in time to the event than today, correct?
Correct.
You didn't notice any lividity or modeling on Michele's body, correct?
I did not.
At the hospital, As you've indicated earlier, you observed Martin. You testified at the interview that once Michele was pronounced dead, he started crying, correct?
Yes.
That's all the questions I have.
Thank you.
I have just a couple questions, Your Honor.
Okay.
Go back to line 175. Would you read line 173?
So when I drove up,
So when you were describing him as frantic, that was at the front porch, correct?
correct.
Okay. And back at line 325, you said, "I can remember cutting off a white shirt and a garment top, and I believe that she had just garment bottoms on, but I'm not sure about that." Were you the person that actually cut her clothing?
I don't remember for sure. I would suspect that that might be the case because I had the monitor and I would be putting on the pads, but I don't remember that
You don't
for
have a
sure.
specific memory of that.
Correct.
Thank you.
Do you have additional questions?
May I approach the exhibit?
Yeah.
Mr. Brand, I'm showing you what's been marked as State's Exhibit 22. Do you recognize that?
Yes.
Roughly a layout of the MacNeill home as you recall it on April 11th?
Yes.
Um, This is the State's Exhibit, so I won't have you write on it. But would you just do a rough sketch of your own and then put the location of Michele's body when you first observed it and then where it was when it was moved?
Counsel, I think they have an extra one
if you want to use it.
if you want him to
Yeah.
mark it. Let's have it marked as defense exhibit. What number is it?
It's B.
B, thank you.
So you would like first where she was and then where she was taken to.
Your Honor, can I approach to watch
You
this?
may, go ahead.
How would you like that?
Stick figures are fine.
Okay. I don't remember her exact position, to tell you the truth. I mean, I can make a generalized impression as to where I thought she was. She was brought probably.
And then, would you just write your name up there so we keep track of that? Thank you. Now we move the defense exhibit B.
Do you
No
intend,
objection.
do you intend to have him mark it in any additional way on redirect? Okay, B is received.
Mr. Brand, do you remember glucose being administered?
No.
What would be the procedure for administering glucose at a scene such as this?
Glucose would be given if it was suspected that the patient was maybe diabetic or hypoglycemic.
Okay. And prior to administering glucose, would it be typical to do a finger stick or finger prick?
Yes.
You wouldn't just administer glucose without checking it first. Is that a fair statement?
Yes.
And may I approach again, Your Honor?
You may.
Again, we're looking at the EMS report. And on the front page, there's no indication that glucose was given, correct?
Correct.
But on the second page, there's an indication that dextrose is a form of glucose, right?
Correct.
There's an indication that dextrose needs to be restocked and that a glucose check needs to be restocked, correct?
Correct.
Would that indicate to you that glucose was given to Michele MacNeill?
It's a possibility. It wasn't given on the scene. It could have been done en route to the hospital, when I wasn't present, but I didn't see that.
That's all the questions I have.
Thank you.
I don't have any.
Do you have any questions? If you could pick those up for me, please. Any others? Okay. Will you approach? Witness marked on the defendant's Exhibit B. I'll just have counsel publish this to you at this time.
I don't have any further questions, Your Honor.
Thank you.
Me neither, Your Honor. Thank you.
Did each of you have a chance to see that? Very good. Would you collect defendant's B? How long will your next witness be?
A few minutes. This may be a good time for a break, Your Honor.
You agree? We'll take our morning recess. Please keep in mind my admonition to you. You are not to discuss the case amongst yourselves or with anyone else. Don't form or express any opinion about the case until it is finally submitted to you for deliberation. Avoid television, internet, radio, news coverage of the trial, and don't do any research on your own using computer devices or something else. Court's in recess.